good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Root Cause Analysis and Systemic Corrective Action webinar. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I'm the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars, and I am filling in for Shannon Craddock. A couple of notes for everyone. All of you are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so we ask that you please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the end of our presentation today. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not the presentation will be made available after we're finished. We do make our presentations available in two key ways. Firstly, if you'd like to get a copy of the slides, those will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And secondly, if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, we do post all of our webinars on our YouTube page, and you'll find the link for that also on our website. Just look for the link previously recorded webinars. Now, our agenda for today, we're going to go over why this webinar was created. We're going to go over how an audit finding is supposed to be developed using the three-part method. We're going to discuss correction actions. We'll take you through root cause analysis and some techniques therein. We'll examine actions taken to prevent recurrence and actions taken to prevent initial occurrence and how those two concepts are distinguished from each other. We'll go over verification activities, and then as promised, we will address your questions. As to why we are doing this particular presentation, PGR has a vested interest in the success of our clients, and we want you to improve. We feel that there should be a strong correlation between third-party audit performance and your quality record with your customers. The intent of doing the audit is not to come out of it with few nonconformances or no nonconformances. The intent is to identify legitimate issues and then enable you to take systemic corrective action to improve your system. And in so doing, your system is strengthened and your ability to take care of your customers and other interested parties is also benefited. Now, as I mentioned, an audit finding is supposed to have three distinct parts. Now, that term finding is kind of a nebulous term. The industry term is nonconformance. And this three-part method that we're going to go over here, it's interesting to note, this is actually mandated by the industry. This is mandated in both ISO 17021-1, which is the standard that PGR is accredited to by the various accreditation bodies that we answer to. And it's also, this three-part method, it's also discussed at length in the ISO 19011 standard. Of course, that is the auditing guidance standard that has bearing not just on the types of audits that PGR does, but on internal audits and supplier audits and things of that nature. So those three parts, we'll name them here and then go a little more in depth. Those are statement of nonconformity, evidence, and citation of the requirement that is not fulfilled. Now, if you get a nonconformance from an auditor that doesn't have those three parts or doesn't have them in the spirit intended, you should not be accepting a poorly written nonconformance. One of your rights as a client, and you have many rights, is to say, look, this is not a nonconformance that we understand. How can we respond to a nonconformance if it has not been written in the intended fashion and include all required information? And of course, your auditor is supposed to be going over your nonconformances with you in the lead up to the closing meeting and in an official capacity during the closing meeting. So you will absolutely have a chance to weigh in on those items and make these kinds of concerns known before the nonconformances become official. Now, sometimes we get questions on what is referred to as an opportunity for improvement. Officially, we have told our auditors that they cannot write opportunities for improvement. Too often, these are viewed as consulting or soft-graded nonconformances. So officially, we don't allow our auditors to write these. Now, you may have these stated by the auditor. That's fine. Hopefully, it does not stray into a form of consulting. But officially, although these are recognized by the industry, PJR, as a matter of policy, does not write opportunities for improvement. So let's begin with the statement of nonconformity. One of the issues that we see with auditors that are not fully competent in this particular skill set is they will write the issue as a symptom of the problem rather than the problem itself. Understand that the expectation is that the problem will be expressed as an issue with your system, whether it be an ISO 9001 quality management system or an ISO 14001 environmental management system. The problem has to be expressed as an issue with the system. If it is expressed in terms of a person or an incident, it's at the symptom stage. It's an evidentiary statement. And we see this at all levels. We see this at times with our auditors at the certification level. We see it in internal audits and so forth. It's important to get to the true problem, the system issue. In a way, we're doing this to help you in formulating your response. Because obviously, if you fix the symptom, that's not necessarily going to help prevent the issue from recurring. So if we cite the systemic issue in writing the finding, you're going to be better enabled to address the issue and take care of the issue. Also, understand that a nonconformity, these records can be looked at for a period of many years. We've had accreditation bodies that have asked for the complete history of a certified client, going back 2, 3, 10 years even. These nonconformances need to be written strongly enough that you can look at them years later and understand exactly what the issue was, so that you can identify patterns and things of this nature. So let's take an example here. Let's say that we had a nonconformance that was written as follows. There was no training matrix for the first shift operator running job 9954, indicating competence to run that job. Now, that is a fine evidence statement, but it is not a statement of nonconformity. This is a symptom. This is not the problem itself. This is confusing evidence with the actual statement of nonconformity. So how might we better write this nonconformance? A better way would be to say the system for recording employee training and competence is not completely effective. And then our evidence statement is exactly what we had before. And then, of course, we cite the applicable requirement or audit criteria. In this case, ISO 9001:2015, clause 7.2D. So in doing this, we've identified there is a system issue at play here. And we kind of separate that out from the symptom. So by calling this out, the system for recording employee training and competence is not effective, focuses attention on the systemic issue. That's the intent of the problem statement. We want to have you focus in on that systemic issue and not necessarily the individual incident. Here's another example. Quality auditor in the blue cell was using an uncontrolled form to record the results of first piece inspection. So I'm sure some of you are picking up on the pattern here. Again, this is the symptom. This is the individual incident. It's not the problem itself. It's not the overall systemic issue. Again, a better finding, processes established to ensure company documents are controlled are not fully effective. And then our evidence statement remains the same. And again, we have a citation of applicable criteria. So in this case, our statement's a little bit different. Processes established to ensure company documents are controlled are not fully effective. We're not mentioning that it was a quality auditor. We're not mentioning the blue cell. We're saying, look, you have an issue with the processes that you've put in place to make sure that the company documents are controlled. This is a systemic statement. It will drive the organization to a systemic fix. And that is, of course, what is ultimately intended here. Now, when you review your nonconformances from your auditor, you should ask yourself a couple of key questions. Are there any issues between symptoms and the real problem? Does this statement of nonconformance focus on the systemic issue? And is the data that's been provided, the evidence statement, does it help us understand what's going on here? Sometimes that can be an issue too. The auditor may be providing you with an evidence statement that is extremely vague, something that you can't wrap your head around and say, well, what did this auditor look at? I'm not understanding this evidence statement. Now, be advised, we do have an advisory, Pgr Advisory number 3. It instructs our auditors that if there is an issue, they have to write it up. And I know this is frustrating at times for those of you that are stewards of a system to feel like, gosh, why do they have to write up everything they find? Well, understand that it's not a gotcha moment. As tempting as it is to dismiss it as a gotcha moment, the intent is, again, we want to provide benefit to the system. We want to ensure that legitimate issues are cited, that they're fixed, that there's continual improvement. Understand that a lot of the industries that drive certification, automotive, aerospace, medical device, and so forth, they want to see results. They don't necessarily just want to see a certificate on your wall. They want to see that the certification means something, that there is tangible benefit from mandating that their suppliers get these certifications. And overlooked or excused nonconformances don't contribute to that goal. That's an important thing to keep in mind. All nonconformances need to be documented using the 3-part method. So let's shift gears now and talk a little bit about the expectations for response. We do have a 4-part response now, and we're going to take you through all 4 of the parts, beginning with what is referred to as corrections or actions taken to correct. Now, correction is actually an officially defined term. It's actions taken to address a particular issue. That's not an exact definition, but it's a paraphrasing of the definition that appears in ISO 9000. You may have also heard the phrase containment action. Containment's not an officially defined term, but it's a very commonly used term. So these are actions that are taken with respect to the symptom, to the incident. These are important, and the expectation is that you need to take these steps immediately. This is not something that you wait 2, 3, 4 months to do. This is something that you're working on the week after the audit. Okay, the auditor found this issue. We need to contain it. We need to correct it so that we can state past tense that this was done. So these actions typically take on 2 forms. We look at things like we calibrated the gauge, we controlled the form, we've added inspection, and so forth. We're going to look at corrective action in a particular way. And we're going to explore how adding layers to your system may or may not be an effective corrective action strategy. Now, you understand that your containment or corrections need to be very specific. We had this earlier example of the training matrix, and we even identified what job it was. Okay, so now in your correction statement, are you stating that the training matrix for the first shift operator was updated to reflect his competency to run the job unsupervised? Or the blue cell operator, all copies of the uncontrolled form that were being used by the auditor in the blue cell were destroyed. Your corrections also need to identify an extent analysis. We're going to get into that a little bit deeper in just a second here, but I want to leave this slide up here for just a second. You can see that these correction statements, in a way, these are opposing statements or mirror images of what the auditor writes in their evidence statement. That's why it's so important for the auditor to get the evidence statement right in the first place, because you are responding to this. You are saying, right, you found the operator with a missing training matrix, or you found a form that wasn't controlled, or you found an uncalibrated gauge. Well, here is the opposite of that. We've filled in the training form, we've calibrated the gauge, we've controlled the form, etc. The evidence statement is very much going to drive the correction. That's the intent. Now, as I mentioned, there are 4 parts to the response. So correction is the first part. The second part is referred to as extent analysis. Now, this is actually the newest of the concepts. Those of you that are current PGR clients with some tenure, if you've been with us for a few years, I'm sure by now you've seen the updated nonconformance report with this extent analysis. And perhaps some of you are even wondering, what is this extent analysis bit all about? What is this? Well, you can understand extent analysis as an extension, very clever, of the correction. And another term that we've heard for it is look across. So the concept here is, okay, the auditor found one item, right? The auditor found an uncontrolled form in the quality audit area, or the auditor found one person whose training matrix wasn't filled in. What are the chances that there are other examples of that incident, right? We've got 100 people here. The auditor found one person. The auditor was here for 2 days. If we spend a week looking at this, what are the chances that we find more of these issues? What is the depth and breadth of this problem? Because obviously you haven't really corrected everything until you've put out every fire, right? Until you have found all of the iterations of that particular problem and addressed all of them. That's the idea behind extent analysis. Like we mentioned, if there's a gauge that's out of calibration, a document that's not controlled, a training record that isn't updated, how many more examples of that are we going to find if we go digging? So a well-written extent analysis potentially might read as follows. We verified the gauges that were found by the PGR auditor, and both were conforming. Our extent analysis included the 213 other gauges in our facility. Only one was found to be out of calibration. It was calibrated, returned to service. No product measured with this gauge since it was last in a known state of calibration. So this tells us then at PGR, okay, good job, PGR. You found 2 incidents. We actually uncovered 1 additional example, and we have taken care of it. So, and here's the statement that backs that up. So now we can feel assured that the issue at large, both what we found and what we didn't find, has been addressed. So as I mentioned, our form has been modified to include a blank space for the extent analysis. Now, one of the questions that we get from time to time is, do we have to respond to nonconformances using PJR's form? By the book, it is not mandatory, but understand that if you choose to use your own document, your own AD form or your own corrective action form or whatever document you're using, if we don't see an extent analysis, we're going to kick it back to you. This is mandatory by the industry, so we're being held accountable to it. So we have to flow that requirement down to our clients. So let's move on to the third part of the required response, and that is root cause analysis. Now, a lot of our one of the issues that we run into from time to time is we will have a client that will turn in their response and they'll restate the incident as their cause analysis. So in the case of the training matrix example we looked at earlier, our organization failed to update the training matrix for the operator running job 9954. Well, we know we did. We know that happened. We wrote the finding. That's not the cause analysis. Or in the blue cell operator, our auditor didn't use the correct form. We know that. We wrote the finding. So you know, it's almost comical in a way if you say it. Our gauge wasn't calibrated because we didn't calibrate the gauge. So understand that it's tempting to put that as the cause analysis, but that's not going to get you anywhere close to identifying the systemic issue. Now, sometimes we'll see containment action for root cause analysis. Sometimes the organization will say, well, it was an oversight on the part of management. Well, that's tempting to blame a human being, but even that we can't really accept because it does not go to the systemic level. Understand that your cause analysis always answers the question, what in your system failed such that the problem occurred? The focus, again, needs to be on the system, not the incident. And I always have something that I say when I do a closing meeting with a client. I say, I operate on the belief that systems fail first and people fail second. That comes off a little bit harsh, but it drives the point home in terms of the expectation on cause analysis. Also, important to understand, sometimes you may have multiple root causes. You know, some problems will have several possible root causes. And if there are multiple root causes, you need to address each one individually. You know, if you arrive at, okay, we didn't have a procedure and we didn't have a process for this particular activity, well, those are two separate items. And both are going to require a separate corrective action. Now, if the root cause has truly been found, the problem can be turned off. That's the idea. If it cannot be turned off, whatever your root cause analysis revealed probably was flawed because you've not gotten down to that root cause. If the issue does not go away, then your cause analysis is either flawed or incomplete. There may be other causes at play that you haven't determined. There's a lot of different techniques you can bring to bear in understanding cause analysis. You know, a lot of clients like to use 5Y. 5Y is it's a way to understand this idea of asking why until you get down to the true cause. You don't have to necessarily do it 5 times. It could be 3 times, could be 20 times. But the idea is to keep working at it until you get down to the systemic cause. The built-in fallacy with 5Y, in some cases, is that it presumes there is a single cause at play. So bear that in mind. Some of our clients have had great success with fishbone diagrams. That's a whole separate technique. And fishbone works on the presumption that there may be multiple causes at play. We've even seen things like root cause checklists, things that can kind of help prompt you on what may or may not be a contributing issue. So with 5Y, as I mentioned, let's take you through an example here. So this was the employee training and competence issue. So again, to begin with, there was no training matrix for the first shift operator, running job, et cetera, et cetera. So if we go through the cause chain here with 5Y, the first shift supervisor failed to update the training matrix as required by the first of the month. Well, why did that happen? Well, before the end of the prior month, the HR manager would email the training matrix template to all of the department supervisors, but that didn't happen this particular time. Why was that? HR manager left the company before the end of the month. Her replacement didn't email the template to the supervisors. Why was that? The procedure for training didn't include a requirement to prompt the new HR manager to email the template to the supervisors. So let's now examine our company document issue. Quality auditor in the blue cell using an uncontrolled form. Controlled hard copies of Form 10, first piece inspection, had all been used in the blue cell, so the quality auditor resorted to an uncontrolled form. So he ran out of paper, basically. Quality auditor in the blue cell was not aware that when no hard copies of a particular form were available, the latest version of all forms could be accessed through the database. Okay, so if we stop there, that's a human error, but we keep going. The blue cell quality auditor was not given a username and password to access the database. How about that? And why was that the case? Because HR didn't have a policy to ensure that new hires were granted a system username and password. So rather than throwing this auditor under the bus and saying he's an idiot and he forgot, we get down to the real cause here, which is we don't have a policy for assigning access. Now we've got something systemic. So as I mentioned, we have a rather strict policy on what we will and will not accept for cause analysis. So if we get something back that says it was an oversight, we didn't understand, it was human error, our consultant screwed up, especially if you blame your consultant, those are getting kicked back every time because it's not a systemic cause analysis if this is what you're leading with. So let's shift gears now and talk about the fourth and final piece of the response puzzle, and that is corrective action. Now, corrective action is also an officially defined term in ISO 9000. It's action taken to eliminate the cause of a detected nonconformance. So by definition, it's supposed to address the root cause. And it should address the question, what in the system failed such that the problem recurred? Now, if you've done a good job of identifying your corrective or your root cause rather, you have your corrective action by default. Remember when I talked about the correction kind of being the mirror reflection of that evidence statement? Understand that root cause and corrective action statements, if they're done properly, those are always going to be mirror images of each other. If you have one, you've always got the other. Now, one of the common mistakes that we see is an organization giving a containment action as a corrective action. Now, that's not acceptable. So, for example, if you tell us, well, we've controlled that form that you found, well, that's not a corrective action. That's a correction, and you needed to do it, but that's not going to prevent uncontrolled forms in the future. Correction and corrective action are distinct concepts. The corrective action needs to address the system. it needs to be a change in the system. Now, one of the things that we get from time to time is, well, we retrained everybody. Retraining is useful, but understand that training by itself is not generally going to be a systemic change. Because what's happening here? You've retrained everybody on an existing process that's unchanged, using existing training methods that are unchanged. You haven't really changed anything in your system. So be careful about leaning on retraining as your corrective action. Understand that this needs to be a change to your system. And if you happen to be in the automotive industry, often, almost always, this is going to mean changes to the contents of your PPAP package, your design FEMA, your process FEMA, your control plan. This may even require a whole brand new, excuse me, part submission warrant to your customer. Excuse me. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you've identified multiple causes, there needs to be at least one corrective action for each cause that you've identified. And your ongoing analysis of the situation should show that the problem has completely disappeared, that this was indeed the issue that needed to be addressed. So again, let's go back to where we started here. The system for recording employee training and competence was not effective. And if you remember what our cause analysis was, it had to do with HR failing to email things based on what was in the HR procedure. So what have we done? We've updated the procedure for training to include a requirement for the HR manager to email the training matrix templates to all supervisors for updating before the end of each month. And then we trained the HR manager on this new requirement, and she has added an automatic reminder to MS Outlook to perform this task. So again, that corrective action, that's a mirror reflection of what we cited as our cause analysis. Here's the other one. Processes established to ensure company documents are controlled, not fully effective. And this was the issue where they said, okay, this had to do with the new hire not knowing what the expectation was or having access credentials. The new hire work instruction revised to include a requirement to grant new hires a username and password for the database, and HR personnel were trained on this change. So in both cases, we've executed systemic change to prevent this particular issue from recurring, assuming that we've got the cause analysis right in both cases. Now, when training is part of your corrective action response, and it often is, your response should also contain the technique that will be used to verify training effectiveness. How are you going to make sure that this is going to take, right? That this is going to stick with your people and with your system. Now, let's shift gears and talk about an older concept, and that is preventive action. We may have some folks on the call that have been with ISO long enough that they remember when preventive action was actually part of the system. If we dial the clock back to the 2008 version of ISO and prior, there was actually a section in ISO 9001 that talked about preventive action. We still see it actually in some standards, including IATF 16949. Preventive action is an interesting idea. It asks the question, are there other systems in my company that might have the same root cause present? Are there things that I could have had in place that would have prevented this from happening? Now, in some cases, companies will position corrective actions as preventive actions. Understand that preventive action, if you're going to address it, this is addressing the future, not the past. This is addressing what could still happen, not what has happened. If it's already happened, it's a corrective action. Preventive action is an action on the system and not the incident itself. Similar idea, preventing future problems. Now, preventive actions are not going to be identified solely because of nonconformances. A lot of the management system standards, as I mentioned, this doesn't include ISO 9001 anymore, but they mandate it as a proactive process. This is going to include inputs from things like near miss reports, 5S programs, lean initiatives, employee suggestions, and so forth. I'll quickly mention also, we have a lot of clients that have positioned preventive action as an aspect of their risk action program. And obviously, risk actions are required under ISO 9001:2015. So this can be a component of your risk program. But the idea is that if you're not getting nonconformances in your audits, internal audits, Pgr audits, and so forth, it does not necessarily mean that you shouldn't be doing things, that you shouldn't necessarily be identifying opportunities for preventive action or opportunities for risk action. Remember, always look to be avoiding problems and addressing problems before they happen. So let's shift gears now and move into the verification phase. And this is actually, at times, it is something that is ignored. Now, PJR's form, we do have a specific space for this. We do address this in a very particular way. It's important that whatever documentation you're using for internal corrective action, that it have a place for this, whether you call it verification or validation or follow-up, whatever nomenclature you choose to apply to this, this needs to happen. This is a critical part of the process. So by the time we get to verification, all the other steps should have been taken. We should have had our containment and our corrections. We've done our cause analysis. We've implemented our extent analysis. We've identified the systemic corrective actions. We have, if possible, taken our preventive actions, if there were any to take. So now we're ready for verification and ensuring that all of these things were appropriate, that they were fully implemented and ultimately effective at preventing the incident from recurring. Corrective actions in times, they can be reversible. System changes mean how the work is going to be performed changes. And understand that change is difficult. Understand that if people find things difficult or frustrating, they may revert to old habits. So it's important that you continue to verify that your actions are working, that changed policies are still being followed, changed procedures are still being adhered to. Don't walk away from a corrective action completely just because the incident appears to be resolved. Use the opportunity to re-verify and ensure that your system is still effective, or I should say your system revisions are still effective. I'd like to acknowledge the IEOB for the slide content that was provided for portions of this presentation. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have a presentation called The Interaction of Processes and its importance to a successful audit. This is an exploration of processes and how to correctly understand them. This is given about twice a year. We also have a special presentation on non-applicable clauses and understanding what can and cannot be excused in an audit assessment. That presentation is also looked at about twice a year. And we've got presentations on a wide variety of other topics: Stage 1 auditing, ISO 9001 itself, IETF 16949, and so forth. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to visit our website at www.pgr.com. Go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address in the provided space, and click subscribe. You will be opted in for automatic updates from PJR on news updates involving standards, upcoming webinars, and other points of interest. I do thank you for your time, and I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard and see if anyone has any questions for me today. Okay, well, as it appears we have no questions, I'll thank you all for your time and have a great day.